the challenge is, as you grow, you recognize that you can't do everything anymore.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, one of the big challenges for entrepreneurs is that sort of transition from letting go. I became fascinated with behavioral economics. I got to work with the Gallup organization, who do some of this stuff really, really well. It was that collaboration. So all of a sudden there were other people who were in similar situations. So, I met other people that then became a part of Freshstone Consulting. So I think there's another level of maturity there that the UAE is gonna see now.
Welcome to the 𝗷𝗄preneurs podcast. I'm your host, Rehan Aleem, founder of 𝗥𝘆𝗵 and 𝗷𝗄pro Partners. Join me on each episode as we talk to inspiring entrepreneurs who share their stories, challenges, and secrets on building world-class businesses. I'm very pleased to have Tanvir Haque join us at the show today. Tanvir has an international career spanning over 25 years with expertise on the development and execution of business strategy. Tanvir is also a chartered accountant, having previously had successful stints at PwC and Andersens. He then set up a successful consulting practice supporting global businesses in the Middle East and Africa. Recently, he now provides CXO services for multinational businesses. Tanvir, welcome to the show. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
The first question I want to start with is your background. So you have a fascinating background. You went from being a tax advisor to now a CXO. You worked for some global consultancies, and now you work with, large companies, entrepreneurs, providing a CXO service. So can you tell us more about your background? How did you go from, being a tax advisor in PwC all the way to being a CXO?
Yeah, well, I guess life for me started as a graduate with Pricewaterhouse. And like many, I guess, young aspiring accountants at the time, the dream was to be a partner one day of one of these. Well, back then it was the Big Five.
Yeah.
So that was the dream. And it's funny how when you reflect back, you think your career is going to go in a certain direction, but along the way there's different paths that you end up taking. So yeah, I started off with Pricewaterhouse, and then Arthur Andersen, who then changed their name to Andersen, and that's where I really got my, what I would say, grounding in accounting. Started off in tax, but within those firms, I also did some general accounting work.
Yeah.
So, this probably shows my age, but I remember with certain clients having to review cash books.
Wow.
So I've, transferred people's data from a physical cash book onto an accounting system. And that's how I started my career. And during my time at Andersens, they sent me over to London as part of my development. And then I think what changed the course of my career was the collapse of Andersens as a result of the collapse of Enron.
Yeah.
So classic corporate governance failure. Andersens were the internal auditors for Enron, and obviously some strange things happened, which then caused the collapse of Enron and Arthur Andersen, or Andersens at the time. And that I sort of became disillusioned with the profession, and I thought to myself, do I really want to be in a position where I may have to, make certain decisions which put integrity at question, values, etc. And I decided to leave the profession. And I took 6 months out. I traveled around Europe. And then luckily I was working for a really good partner at Andersens, and he then put me in touch with Standard Chartered Bank.
Yeah.
And I ended up working at Standard Chartered Bank for a few years, and then ended up in a HR function. So it was really
from tax to accounting
and accounting to a HR function.
So would you say that part of being a CXO is the fact that you've built a lot of these, skills, depth of skills in your career that's helped you become the CXO that you are now, where you can do lots of different aspects of strategy in different roles as well?
Absolutely. I think without a doubt, I think like I said earlier, Pricewaterhouse and Anderson's, they really give you the grounding of your ability to be a future leader.
Yeah.
They really give you solid training, and without that, I don't think I would, be where I am today. And then, the thing about Standard Chartered was, ending up in a HR function, and yes, I was doing a very similar role to what I was already doing at Anderson's, which was related to tax and international assignment programs.
Yeah.
But the HR director gave me the opportunity to learn more about what HR actually does. And in fact, it was a pretty sort of a profound moment in my career, because what that experience allowed me to do was understand behavioral economics. And so as an accountant, we are all looking at numbers every day, but that experience actually led me to understand that those numbers actually are a result of behaviors.
Yeah.
And so I became fascinated with behavioral economics. I got to work with the Gallup organization, who do some of this stuff really, really well.
Yeah.
They're a research company, but they're based, it's a US-based company, but they've been around for 50, 60 years. Most people know them as pollsters doing, the Gallup polls.
Yeah.
But actually, they're behavioral scientists. So they try, just the ability to understand how behaviors drive numbers was.
Can you give us some examples of behaviors that you've come across that drive numbers?
Yeah, so I guess what Gallup's philosophy is all about allowing people to play to their strengths.
Right.
So they have some tools that identify or help people identify what their talents are. And then, certain organizations like Standard Chartered want to build strengths-based organizations.
Yeah.
So when they're hiring people, they're sort of, the way they manage those people is to allow them to play to their strengths. So, for myself, for example, my 5 key strengths from the Gallup perspective is, I'm competitive, I love to learn, I love to develop people, I love to influence people, and if I'm in an environment where I can use those talents and play to those talents, then I'm going to be a happy employee, or a happy person. So that, that was really key, a key part of my career. And then after that, I had an opportunity to go and start working with some entrepreneurs. I had a friend that wanted to start up a biodiesel manufacturing facility, and he said, "Can you come and help me build a business plan and a bit of a strategy?" And I left Standard Chartered to sort of almost, that was the beginning of what I would probably say is that fractional CXO journey.
Yeah.
So being able to bring different functional expertise and elements that I've picked up during my career into the world of entrepreneurship and helping people who own businesses to solve business problems around how to grow, how to become more profitable.
Yeah.
Which, any business owner, even like yourself, those are the problems, or those are the opportunities and challenges that you really want to address as a business owner.
So just for the listeners, what is a CXO? How would you describe that kind of role, and what type of stage would you need something like that as an entrepreneur?
Yeah, look, I think a CXO is just a fancy word for a business coach, to be honest, or just a leader that comes into your business that has some good specific experience
Yeah.
or mixture of experience, skills, and talent. So that's what I think, a CXO is, just someone who's got the ability to step in to a business and act as a leader, not necessarily a full-time leader, but a part-time leader.
Yeah.
So a lot of entrepreneurs, a lot of startups, a lot of SMEs, they can't afford a full-time CFO.
Yeah.
So let's take a CFO as an example. Generally, they, by the time you get to a CFO level, you've got 15 to 20 years experience behind you.
Yeah.
And startups and small businesses, they can't afford a full-time CFO.
Yeah.
So a fractional CXO is, as the name suggests, they come in maybe 1 day a week, half day a week, whatever that is.
Yeah.
And you pay for that service on a fractional basis.
I think also the key thing about CXO is there are weaknesses that entrepreneurs have, and you're basically filling in those gaps as well.
Yep.
And what I resonate about the HR function that you did at Standard Chartered is the fact that one of the key limits to growth for entrepreneurs is the HR function. They don't have a HR function, and they don't hire the right people, and they don't hire for values necessarily. They don't have a value statement that they want to hire employees on. What kind of experience have you had in kind of helping the HR side for entrepreneurs?
So look, probably not as much, because generally the type of work that I'm doing at the moment revolves more around setting or establishing a strategy and then executing that strategy. But as executing that strategy requires the right people, because one of the main reasons that strategies fail is because you haven't got the right people.
Yeah.
You haven't got the right culture in your business. You haven't got the right reward structure in place. So they're common challenges. Look, I think the bane of all entrepreneurs and small business owners is people. If you ask them what their number one challenge is, they will generally say people.
Yeah.
Because what happens is they'll hire some good people initially, and then they'll learn, they'll develop, and then they get snapped up. Or they might, their career progression sort of gets halted because of the size of the business.
Yeah.
I think that is a challenge that remains constant in my view. You're always looking for talent to grow, and it's also part of the growing pains of an SME as well. I think the challenge is, as you grow, you recognize that you can't do everything anymore.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, one of the big challenges for entrepreneurs, is that sort of transition from letting go. And so what I find, or what I try and do with entrepreneurs and business owners is, there's a classic case where they're working in the business rather than working on the business.
Exactly, yeah. Good point, yeah.
So trying to get them to, it's difficult because you need to have the right people to sort of let go a bit so that you can then focus on the business.
Yeah.
So look, I think it's just, if you can have a good talent acquisition process where you can identify the right talent for what you need, great. And then it's, whether you can compete with everyone else to grab that talent.
Yeah.
And that's the challenge, because you're not the only entrepreneur in the world. You're not the only sort of business in the world. You're all fighting for the same talent generally. But I think going back to my Standard Chartered days and a lot of the books that you read, it's hire for attitude rather than hiring for skills and experience, because you can actually teach and learn skills, whereas it's much more difficult to teach talent.
Yeah. No, I 100%. I mean, in my organization, whenever we go through the selection process of accountants for Alpha Pro, the first thing we look at is attitude. We have a strong culture. And it all starts from obviously our values, but also the hiring process as well, and making sure that when we hire the right accountants, we're hiring for attitude first. I mean, myself, I'm not too fussed if they're qualified or not. If they can do the job, then great. If they can't do the job, doesn't matter if you're a chartered accountant or someone who's got 20 years of experience. You just can't do the job, and you're just going to create problems.
So let me ask you a question. So let's be specific. So what characteristic or what attitude are you specifically hiring for? Can you name it?
Yeah, no, 100%. So we have one of the key focuses for us is have good customer service, which means that we need to have accountants or account managers who can go the extra mile, help the entrepreneur. So one of the things we hire for is, do they have good customer service, right? Do our account managers, are they empathetic towards the needs of the entrepreneur? Many entrepreneurs, they have certain characteristics, but they effectively need help. Some ask for help in a aggressive way, some in a passive aggressive way, and some they ask for help. They probably don't ask for help, but you have to kind of figure out what that help is. And so there's a bit of empathy that some of our accountants needs to have with the entrepreneur. And then it's kind of having strong communication. If you have strong communication skills with your account manager, you can build that relationship. You don't have good communication skills. If you're asking for something and you just do a one line email, it's transactional, that interaction. Whereas if you say to the entrepreneur, look, we need your bank statements because we need to, reconcile your accounts. We need to make sure that accounts receivables are up to date. They understand the end goal of why we're asking that. And so that's also important in terms of when we hire account managers, because it's very much a people person, the accounting business.
Yeah.
And that's really important. We don't do complicated accounts. We do, we work with small businesses, so we're not working with, big blue chip companies. Yeah. So the accounting process is not too complicated. A lot of the skills can be learned, within 6 months. So that's why I don't necessarily go with qualified accountants. If we do find them, great, but we go for more attitude-based accountants. Do they have the right attitude? Do they have empathy? That's what we go for.
Yeah, I must say, so, going back to your earlier question of how I got into, being a fractional CXO or, a fractional leader, a business coach, I think, to be honest, I think accountants are sometimes their own worst enemy, really, honestly, because so if you look at what accountants do, I think what they do really well is the compliance stuff, right? So they can get the books done, whether they're complex or not complex. They're often not accessible either. And then pricing. So some accountants, are still living in the day of trying to sell the hour rather than sort of fixed priced product and service, which a lot of accountants have now moved to. But actually, based on my experience and asking entrepreneurs, what do they really want from their accountant or, business coach or someone who understands accounting, finance? What they actually want is someone to help them grow and become profitable. That's the number one thing that I find entrepreneurs want or need, because they get to a stage where they need to take that next jump. So I think you probably know him, 𝗥𝘆𝗵𝗵𝗃 talks about the black hole, those $1 million companies going from 1 million to 5 million, and they struggle in that sort of middle stage because they've got to take that step. They, like we were talking about earlier, they've got to now employ more people to make that growth. And so often that's what they're looking there, for the accountant or that fractional CXO to help them with. So that's why I think the accounting profession, in my view, needs to step up.
Yeah.
And I'm not talking about, the big four or the big five. I'm talking about firms like yourself, where you are, like you say, you're identifying that need from an entrepreneur, but not just producing the books for them, but then talking to them about what are those numbers actually telling you.
Yeah.
And that's where the value is, in my view. And yes, entrepreneurs, you're going to have some entrepreneurs who are very savvy financially and sort of understand the numbers.
Yeah.
But what I've found, and so that's the case, but often those ones are actually too busy to look at their numbers properly to see what it's telling them. And then you'll have some entrepreneurs who just don't have a gut for numbers and that do need that extra coaching around, right, these are the numbers.
Yeah.
But this is what the numbers are telling me about my business. And I think that's the opportunity for accountants, in my view.
So your first business venture was Freshstone. This is your first kind of entrepreneur. This is your first journey to entrepreneurship. And Freshstone was a consulting business back in the UK. Tell us more about how you transitioned from being, an employee to an entrepreneur. We have many listeners who've gone through that process, or maybe be thinking about, I've got a great idea, but I want to start a business. So, you've obviously been through that stage previously before. What kind of things would you share about that? How were you able to get clients? How were you able to service them? Is there any challenges that you found that you was able to overcome?
Yeah. Oh God. It's there's a lot to sort of unpack there. So look, Freshstone was, I guess, the first entrepreneurial venture, which sort of lasted a good 14, 15 years, spanning both the UK and then Dubai.
Yep.
So after Standard Chartered, I sort of decided, right, that's enough. I want to go out on my own and I want to do some consulting. I want to work with entrepreneurs. I want to work with business owners and solve business problems. That's how I sort of, started one-man band. And it's funny because it's much harder than what you anticipate or expect, because what had happened was, up until then, you build a lot of relationships, you build a lot of networks, and you think, you know what, I know some good people, I know they're going to give me work.
Yeah.
But it doesn't work that way, because it's a competitive landscape. So,
also, they may not be ready.
And they may not be ready, true. But generally, if and when you are pitching for some work, you're pitching against other consulting businesses.
Yeah.
They may be more mature than you are. They've been around much longer. You think that because you're smaller, you're more nimble, but what you sort of realize is that people are a little bit more cautious. And they generally want to work with firms that have a bit more, they've been around a bit more. So that was a huge eye opener for me. And getting my first piece of work was quite difficult. It took me a good, if I'm trying to remember, it took me a good 6 months before I landed my first piece of work, and that was with HSBC.
Oh, nice.
All right, so. But again, I had to rely on a relationship to let me in the door and actually pitch for the work. And thankfully, it was a small project, and it was around some of the work that I had done at Standard Chartered around graduate recruitment programs.
Yep.
But this one was in particular for HSBC's finance function, and just sort of reviewing that part of their graduate program. And then, luckily, I pitched for another piece of work for a property development company in London. Again, that was through a referral. So a relationship that then referred me to a CEO of a property development company. Did a piece of work around process re-engineering, for these guys, and I think I did a reasonably good job. And the CEO said, "Listen, could you do the same piece of work in Dubai?"
Yeah.
And that's how I ended up in Dubai.
Nice.
So I came over, did a piece of work, and to cut the long story short, CEO asked if I wanted to stay on and become the chief operating officer. And I said, "Look, I've got a young family," and they were like, "No, move over, come across, come and work for us." And actually, this is probably the second piece of bad luck that happened during my career or entrepreneurship journey. That was September 2008. GFC was already, the global financial crisis was already pretty much, or it had hit the UK, but not so much in Dubai. And then, so I arrived in September 2008, and by December, I realized that the company was in a bit of trouble. And lo and behold, the company didn't exist by, I think it was end of January 2009.
Oh, wow.
And so Freshstone was reborn. And so the CFO of this company and I decided to, start from scratch. And again, but the only difference this time was we were new in Dubai. We didn't have many relationships. We didn't have that many contacts. We didn't have that many networks. So we were out there, trying to pitch for work in the midst of a financial crisis.
But what I like about that is you learn, many entrepreneurs, they do very well in good times. And then when bad times happen, they don't understand what made them successful. And they crash, right? But the fact that you was able to grow your business during a depression, not even a recession, it was a depression, right? Means that you really had to scratch the barrel for work. You learn a lot of lessons. What's interesting for me is, what kind of things were you having to do? I'm sure you learned a lot of lessons through that period. What kind of advice can you give to entrepreneurs off the back of that?
It's network and relationships. So if I look at what I was doing back then, I was attending as many networking events as I could, much less than, say, what I am doing today. But back then, that was the first thing. You're not going to win work by sitting at your desk. So it was really going out, meeting people, trying to get people to introduce you to other people. That's what it was all about. Really sort of just reaching out, connecting to people, and pitching for work. So that then enabled us to win some work. So we tried to do this whole outsourcing thing. So obviously, with the financial crisis, businesses need to cut costs. So one of the first things we tried to do was pitch accounting outsourcing services. Won a couple of clients there. We even won clients from Australia.
Nice.
So that was good. Then the other part that really I think helped was, as part of this sort of building relationships, it was that collaboration. So all of a sudden there were other people who were in similar situations. So, I met other people that then became a part of Freshstone Consulting.
Nice.
And so they were freelance consultants or working, were also impacted by the global financial crisis and needed, to win work as consultants. And so, I remember, Kerry, a good friend of mine who I was introduced to through another person that I'd met while I was networking. She had leadership development background, so coaching CEOs, right? So and entrepreneurs. And so what I talked to her about, I said, listen, I think we can build a great product where we're coaching business owners and entrepreneurs, not CEOs of large companies, and helping entrepreneurs identify what they need in terms of helping them grow their business, and they often needed some coaching as a leader, and so Kerry provided that service. So that was a service offering that Freshstone could provide.
Have you read the book $1 Trillion Coach?
I've not read the book $1 Trillion
Okay.
Coach.
You got to read that.
Okay.
It's basically it's about the coach Bill Walters.
Okay.
And he coached Google founders. He was the coach for Steve Jobs as well.
Oh, wow.
And it's an amazing book. There's so much you can learn from it. But the key thing for me, especially for entrepreneurs, is you need to have coaches. You need to have mentors and coaches, no matter where you are, which stage you're at.
Yeah.
You just don't know. Every day you're making decisions.
Yeah.
And making sure you have the right people around you when you're making those decisions is very important.
Yeah.
And there's lots of people been there, done that already.
Yeah.
And they can definitely give you the expertise that you need. And so, the fact that you collaboration is important as well.
Yep.
Because sometimes you may perceive your competition as competition, but actually you can collaborate with them.
Absolutely.
But yeah, so hats off to you.
No, thanks. I mean, it's interesting you talk about that. And so I'm going to put that book on my reading list. So, I forgot to mention that I'm actually a Gallup certified strengths coach as well.
Nice.
So that was something that during my time at Standard Chartered that, like I mentioned, they were building a strengths-based organization. So what they were doing was building a network of coaches.
Yep.
And so you would end up coaching your colleagues across the business, and that's something which I still use today. So it's the Gallup Strengths Finder. So that's a tool that I often use with business owners, with CEOs, or with CFOs, CMOs, basically leaders who need some sort of coaching. But yeah, Kerry obviously was a specialist in this area. So we collaborated, and that was a part of the service that we offered.
So Tanvir, you was at Arthur Andersen at the time.
Andersons. They changed their name
at the time of the Enron collapse.
Yeah.
When I was studying my accountancy, it was a case study that they kept repeating over and over again, so you don't forget the Enron collapse. And I guess it's obviously to do with accounting irregulations. But what I would like to know about your experience at that time is not necessarily the intricacies of what happened, right? Because that's more accounting related, but more to do with, you was in an organization where it was going through severe crisis management, and an organization where it was about to be extinct, right? And entrepreneurs, they live on that line every day. Many entrepreneurs are 1 week away from, closing the doors, switching off the lights because they don't have the cash flow coming in. So from a crisis management point of view, what kind of things can you, or are you able to, tell us about what happened then, experiences that you can share that can help other entrepreneurs?
Yeah, look, it's interesting you mentioned that, it was a case study while you were studying your accountancy, exams, or while you were, learning to be an accountant. During my MBA, so I did an executive MBA a few years ago, and interestingly, in the the governance module, the professor used the Andersons and Enron example as a classic case of corporate failure. So even in the MBA schools, they're teaching this case study. And having been there and lived through it, it was, I mean, at the time you sort of caught up in the moment.
Yeah.
And you don't, actually, it's weird. You don't really sort of see it as a crisis. I mean, yeah, you see it as a crisis, but it's weird. Things just happen really quickly. and before you know it, the firm is no longer in existence. So I think and then trying to sort of take that and sort of apply it to the world of an entrepreneur, I think that the biggest learning or the lesson that can be learnt is, and this is the word that gets used commonly nowadays and is, as a profession, is also growing, is risk and resilience.
Yeah.
Right. So I think no matter how large or small you are in terms of the size of business, it's important that you take the time to know what your risks are. And actually, what I try and do is not use the word risk either, especially when it comes to SMEs or entrepreneurs. I use the word threat. So what are the threats that are going to stop you from achieving your goals or your plans? And just be able to identify them. And it's not like, you don't have to come up with a list of 100 threats. It's, what are the top threats? So cash flow.
Yeah.
That's the top threat for an entrepreneur or an SME. So once you've identified that, it's then about, okay, how am I going to mitigate it? So what do I need to do to make sure that I've got cash coming in?
Yeah.
So does that mean I need someone calling my customers every week to get my invoices paid, as an example?
Yeah.
Because if you don't have that control, so that's a control mechanism to mitigate that threat, then you could be shutting down because no one's paying you.
Yeah.
So I think as an entrepreneur, it's about taking the time to understand what threats are going to potentially shut your business down.
Yeah.
And once you've identified that, it's then saying, right, I'm going to have these things in place to try and mitigate that. And in risk management speak, or audit speak, or internal audit speak, that's controls. So what controls have you got in place to mitigate that threat? And then the resilience bit is all around, okay, so if that threat does materialize, and in some cases it will kill you and it will shut you down, but in some cases it won't. And in that situation, you've then got to work out, how you're going to continue operating during that disruption or, that sort of event happening.
Yeah.
And working your way through it, so you bounce back, and then you should learn from that as well. So it's sort of like this feedback loop around learning from an uncertain, or from a threat that's actually materialized.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that's sort of, it's the whole Enron thing. Yeah, it's a case study in its own. They teach it at MBA schools, and obviously in the accounting profession itself. It is a classic lesson of sort of corporate failure.
Yeah.
Misstating your financials, is a common. It's common, even amongst entrepreneurs. So this is actually brings me back to one of the things I sort of work with business owners is profit in a SME or in an entrepreneur's business is often distorted.
Yeah.
Why is it distorted? Because they're not capturing the right information and data. And one of the biggest thing, again, Vern Harnish talks about this in Scaling Up, and so does Greg Crabtree. So it's about making sure that as an owner of the business, you're paying market-based wages. Because if you're not, then you're overstating your profits. And so sometimes you need to maintain two separate books, because yes, you may not be able to afford to pay yourself a market-based wage, but what you should be doing is capturing that so that you build your business as quickly as possible to pay yourself that market-based wage. So yeah. It's being sort of recognizing that you've got to be true to yourself and make sure the numbers reflect the reality. So, I've been to many events where you talk to entrepreneurs and they tell you, oh, yeah, I'm running at 20% profit margin. But when you actually look at their books, they haven't recorded their own salaries.
Yeah.
Because they're taking distributions or they're just, So, yeah, that I think, be true to yourself. Get rid of the distortions from your numbers so that you're really evaluating the correct picture of your business. Understand the threats that are going to stop you from achieving your plans, and often that's related to revenue growth, profit, margin, etc.
Yes, it's also almost like not living in a full sense of security as well. So Tanvir, you've worked in numerous countries. You've worked in the UK, you've worked in Saudi, you've done business in the UAE, and you've also worked in Australia as well. So as someone who's worked in multiple regions, what are the things that are different between one region and the other? What kind of advice can you give to entrepreneurs who are looking to set up in Saudi, or they want to do some business in the UK, or even Australia? What kind of advice can you give to entrepreneurs from that point of view?
Wow. Okay. Interesting. So I would say, Australia and the UK quite similar.
Yeah.
From a sort of a cultural perspective and I guess business maturity as well. The UAE, in my view, and Saudi is now sort of, I think, seeing this. From when I first arrived in 2008 to where we are today, there's been a sort of a massive, what I would say is it's almost, the culture from a business perspective is almost the same as, Australia, UK, US, that level.
It's matured a lot.
It's matured a lot. I think Saudi is sort of seeing that maturity. I think it's probably a little bit behind the UAE, or it is behind the UAE, but you can see that they're wanting to go along that same sort of trajectory. I guess the biggest difference there is the size of markets. I mean, Saudi's a massive market, so massive opportunity there compared to the UAE. That's the only thing I'd say about the UAE. You're talking about a much smaller market compared to UK, Australia, and even Saudi. I think what's really interesting is with the introduction of corporate tax.
Yep.
Right. So I've come from a market where tax is a part of everyday life.
Yeah.
And tax, there was no tax here. so often from a business perspective, you didn't really need to worry about tax.
Yeah.
Whereas in places like Australia and the UK, tax was fundamental. So as part of business planning, you had to do tax planning. So I think that there's another level of maturity there that the UAE is gonna see now. I don't know. I don't think. I think a lot of the skills and experiences that I've got from Australia and the UK are the same and transferable and applicable here. And
would you say the work ethic in the UK is the same as Australia?
Yes. So again, work ethic is interesting, and I think that depends on what industries you've worked in and where you've worked. I think Australia, UK, and even the UAE, I think, people work incredibly hard here in the UAE. And it depends on what you're defining as work ethic as well, right? So if that is being interpreted as, people who work hard, have a good entrepreneurial sort of network, and allow entrepreneurs to flourish, I actually think the UAE is probably more advanced than, say, Australia and the UK.
Oh, wow.
I mean, well, So maybe that's changed over
Recently.
time and
Yeah.
more recent. But you know, whenever I go back to Australia and you know, UK, you often hear about people, you know, they're just complaining about tax. All right. So it's an interesting phenomena. And people seem to be just working to pay tax.
Yeah.
And I think inflation and the recent sort of cost of living crisis in these markets doesn't help either. So, you know, things become more expensive. Admittedly, Dubai is not cheap either, but I think that there just seems to be this. It's really, you know, it's really interesting. There seems to have been this sort of flip or transition where I think, you know, the UAE is seen to be more dynamic, more entrepreneurial than, say, Australia or the UK.
Wow.
I mean, I guess that's just my perception and through anecdotal sort of evidence. I don't have any, you know, science or research to back that up, but I don't know. That's the sense I get. And look, you know, most of the people that you know I'm sort of working with are also from either the UK or the US or you know, Australia. So there's not much, you know. So yeah,
I would say UAE is probably the best place to start a business then.
I think so at the moment. It's you know, land of opportunity. I think the only limiting factor, if I'm being completely honest, is the size of the market.
Yeah, the market size.
So
Yeah,
market size sort of plays against you, which then means, you know, from a competitive landscape perspective, it's a little bit tougher as well. And you probably, you know, you're probably best placed to sort of comment on that too, because the way I see it, there's a dime a dozen accounting firms in this market. And if you ignore the top 5 and you know, those second tier firms, there's a, you know, huge amount of accounting firms.
Yeah.
But they're servicing a small market. So that's the only real challenge.
Interestingly,
with the UAE market.
In the UAE market for accounting firms specifically, anyway, if you compare the number of accountants to businesses in the UAE compared to the UK, it's actually less.
Oh wow!
Yeah,
okay,
it's actually less. So there's actually more opportunities for accounting firms here, especially with corporation tax coming in as well.
Yep.
I mean, I set up my accounting firm. I mean, I had the accounting firm in the UK, but we set up predominantly here, mainly because for me, it was a lot of competition in the UK. And to start it here, start from scratch, bring it here, I felt that there was more opportunities for me. It was tough in the beginning because I came in 2016. So at that time, there was a bit of a downturn in the market. But post VAT, post 2018, it just started picking up, and it's been picking up quite well ever since in my industry with small businesses. But market size, it's small in the sense that, you know, you go to Saudi and you're a contractor, you can get, you know, $10-20 million contract, right? Here that you don't hear of that as often.
Yeah.
And I guess that's where the challenge is as well. I don't have experience of Australia, but I know that in the UK it's quite competitive to get those types of contracts. And things are changing a lot in the UK as well. You know, there's, as you said, cost of living crisis. Liquidity is not in the market as it used to be. I guess one of the main differences between here and the UK is you have a safety net in the UK. So if you are not able to, if your business fails, you know, there are bankruptcy laws that allows you to kind of restructure your debts, for example, and it's easier for small businesses to get loans if needed. But I think that's changing.
Yeah,
I think in the UAE, obviously they've brought in a new bankruptcy law. There are banks and institutions that are willing to put money into the SME market. And I think it's a matter of time, and population keeps growing.
Yeah.
So if you're here for the long run, then I think great. If you're here for a quick buck, not
Yeah.
the market for you, I don't think.
No, and I think, and I guess the way around, especially in the accounting sense, is, like you said, I think you've got some very specific customer-centric focus, and I guess as that's a key differentiator for your business.
Yeah.
So look, while I've identified that as a challenge, I think there's an opportunity there as well, and that opportunity is by differentiating. And if you can differentiate yourself from the rest, like any other business,
yeah,
I think you'll succeed.
So Tanvir, you've been a solopreneur at some point in your career as an entrepreneur. What would you say the pros and cons are of being a solopreneur? There are plenty of listeners who are working for someone else at the moment, and they prefer to set up their own business. There are some entrepreneurs who they've got a team, but they pretty much like working on their own. So from your point of view, what would you say the pros and cons are as a solopreneur?
Yeah. So I think the pros are flexibility.
Yep.
Right. I think that's probably the biggest sort of, it's a bit of a lifestyle thing, right? So it gives you that flexibility to work at your own pace, subject to your clients' requirements. Whether you're working from home, whether you're working in an office. So I think flexibility is probably the biggest advantage when it comes to, I guess, being a solopreneur. On the flip side, the con or the disadvantage is probably you're limited by your own capacity.
Yeah.
So if you're gonna take a typical day, your availability is 7 hours a day, and you sort of work 5 days a week, then that's what you're probably limited to. So that it's going to be difficult for you to grow beyond that.
Yeah.
And I guess that's the sort of the disadvantage. I think the other disadvantage goes back to what we were talking before around is that sometimes businesses want a brand name behind the work that's being delivered. It gives them that sense of security and assurance, et cetera, whereas when you're a one-man band, it's
But I think that's changed now, especially with personal branding, right? I think with the new generation of entrepreneurs coming up, I think that if you have a strong personal brand and you resonate with them on social media, I think that can kind of transcend the brands of a Big Four, for example.
Yeah.
But I guess if you're working with like large organizations, then by default they will go for the Big Four or the McKinseys or the the Bains and all of that, because that's what their board wants.
Yeah.
That's what they're going to get sign off from.
Yeah, good point. Absolutely. But I think, again, I guess what then that does is you're limiting your sort of, I guess, the market.
Yeah.
So, maybe that means you can only really work with a certain size of business, which is fine. And again, that's fine. But then cost does come into play, right? So the smaller you are, the less,
the lower the budgets,
the lower the budgets, etc. So it's sort of, and that's what tends to happen. So, I can give you a classic example is, you go and pitch some work, and then, a larger, bigger firm with a bigger budget is willing to pay almost the same rate as what they're going to pay a Big Four or a Big Five for some individualized, specialized consulting. Whereas if you go to the smaller firm or the smaller business, they would even half that rate is going to maybe give them a bit of a rude shock. Right. So, and I find that today, even today. So to give you, as an example, I'm providing some, consulting or fractional CXO services to a reasonably big oil and gas business in Abu Dhabi.
Yeah.
So they are quite, prepared to pay me a sort of a day rate that's equivalent to, say, what a senior consultant would get at Pricewaterhouse or, Ernst & Young. On the flip side, and in fact, using a referral that you gave me, then there's someone who is just looking to start from scratch. It's a startup business. They want to start their first yoga studio, but can't pay the same.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So I guess goes back to flexibility, not in terms of, the time that you spend. You've got to be flexible in terms of what you can charge.
Yeah.
As long as as long as you've sort of understood that, then it works.
I guess also one of the, if you're going to go down the route of being a solopreneur, and you want to have good work-life balance, you don't want to work over the weekend, the value proposition has to increase, right? Which means that there needs to be more work that you need to do as an individual to show the market your perceived value, so you can charge a higher fee as a result. Or I guess you could always win the job and outsource, right? As a model as well. But yeah.
Yeah, look, I think that, like you say, there's pros and cons.
Yeah.
And I think as long as you're aware of what they are, then yes, being a solopreneur works as well. But at the end of the day, you're just limited in terms of the growth. And so that's the only thing that I would say.
Cool. Speaking of entrepreneurs, obviously you've been in entrepreneurship for a very, very long time. Very experienced entrepreneur yourself. Which entrepreneurs have you kind of got inspiration from? Who do you look up to? If there's any biography books, what would you recommend?
Yeah. So I think, if I look at sort of the ones that are sort of most recognizable by everyone, and what I'm assuming most people know of them, I think one of them has to be Steve Jobs.
Yeah.
I think what was so inspiring about Steve Jobs and what he did was, I think when he took, the classic story, Apple was, struggling.
Yeah.
Before he took over as CEO again. And I guess the thing about Steve Jobs was that I think what he did was just made the simple, made the strategy very simple, and didn't complicate stuff, and the way he could communicate. It's an inspirational story around, how he turned Apple around to what it is today. I think if you look at what he did, Apple had so many products and services, and they were trying to be everything to anyone, and he just came in and said, right, enough's enough. We're going to focus on the B2C market and the B2B market. And these are the products, that we're going to use to satisfy those customers. Really simple, and then just executed on it.
And this is a Steve Jobs 2.0, right?
Yes.
So his infamous kind of character was more to do with the 1.0 when he first started Apple.
Exactly. I'm talking about Apple 2.0 then, or Steve Jobs 2.0. So look, he's definitely one that inspires me, and I've read his sort of, biography and books and all that type of stuff.
The one written by Walter Isaacson.
That's the one.
Yeah.
Yep. And then I guess the other one that sort of is quite inspiring, and you, again, a bit like Steve Jobs, you either love him or hate him, but is Elon Musk.
Yep.
Right. So he's, I guess, just one-mindedness to disrupt the automotive industry. That's quite inspiring. And I think, the EV automobile market is thanks to him, I guess. And he's really, again, just that sort of one-mindedness to solve a problem. I haven't read his biography. I've bought the biography, but it's about this big. So that's one that's on my sort of reading list. But again, he's sort of someone that does inspire, or has inspired me, and I think inspires many people. But if I bring it closer to home and look at, who have I worked with or for during my career? I think I mentioned before when I worked at Standard Chartered, CEO at the time, Mervyn Davis, absolute, he was a fantastic CEO.
Yep.
And just to give a bit of context, he took over Standard Chartered when the share price was £3, and within 4 years it was £17.
Wow.
And a lot of that, in my view, is, he brought entrepreneurial spirit in a corporate environment.
It's tough.
Which is tough.
Yeah.
Right. So
especially in the bank.
in a bank, in
that's
financial services, that's been around for over 100 years,
right?
Yeah, over 100 years, or maybe even 150 years. And one of the courageous things he did, and this is, it goes back to hiring for attitude rather than skill. The CFO that he brought into his team was not a finance guy. He was a management consultant.
Oh, wow.
From McKinsey's. And he got a lot of heat from the analysts. They would, people were like, how could you, not hire a finance guru? So going back to hiring for attitude rather than skills or experience, this is a classic case of, that's what I learned, is that, traditionally, when you look at, job specs and job adverts, everyone wants the same experience. They're not willing to, think outside the box or, fish in a wider talent pool. So that's what I learned from Mervyn, is that, be courageous.
Yep.
You don't have to hire for experience. So he really inspired me. But the other thing about Mervyn was he was a great communicator. And let me just give you an example. Every Friday, he would leave a voice message on everyone's phone globally around what he did during a week. It was a short, 5 minute, or maximum 2, 3, 4, 5 minute. You listen to him, and he just gave you a rundown of what he was doing. It was brilliant. Just, but he was just a great communicator. And then, I guess from a UAE perspective, I know that, I'm not sure if you know of the coffee shop. They're called Boon.
They're in my building.
Oh, are they?
Yeah. I go for the coffee every lunchtime.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's such an inspirational story, because Arit, who is the founder of that business, started that business really out of, just a love for coffee. So of Ethiopian background, and if you hear her story about how she started, it's just brilliant. So the Ethiopians love their coffee.
Yeah.
And they make it in a particular way. And the way, Arit and her husband Abdul have grown from literally that first store in your building to now 10, retail shops across the UAE is really inspiring. I mean,
wow.
It's just, an idea was born. To me, if you define what entrepreneurship is, it's about, that you've got an idea, and that idea is going to turn into customers. And that's what they did. Arit had an idea, and now she's turned them that idea into loads of customers.
Yeah, but the other thing I like what you said is that she loved the idea that she had, right?
Yeah.
She loved coffee.
Yeah.
And from my experience of working with entrepreneurs, it's the ones that really love what they're doing. They really succeed.
Yeah.
Because when the going gets tough, you kind of want to pack it in, a lot of the entrepreneurs anyway, or they lose love for their business. But you really have to love what you're doing to really see through the hard times.
Yeah.
And I'm sure they've been through a lot of hard times as well. But they're thriving. You see a new chain pretty much all the time. Great coffee as well.
Yeah.
We're not getting sponsored, but we need to get sponsored. But yeah, no.
You should get her on a podcast, actually.
Possibly, yeah. Coming after you. So, Tanvir, obviously we're wrapping up now. What's the best way that our listeners can reach out to you? And is there anything that you want to kind of, what's your final words for the listeners at the moment?
Yeah, look, in terms of getting in touch with me through you, they can get in touch with you and you can give them contact details, etc. Or just, get onto the LinkedIn and look me up and connect with me and we can get the ball rolling. But I think, in terms of, words of wisdom, it's difficult, right? Because entrepreneurs, like you say, they're in it for the love. Usually, they do almost everything and anything to keep that business running.
Yeah.
And sometimes I think that's a bit of a blind spot, right? So that often entrepreneurs don't recognize when they need that extra bit of support.
Yep.
Or help. So I think, that sort of acceptance that sometimes you can't do everything on your own, and you need a bit of outside help. So coaching, in my view, if you're an elite athlete, they all have coaches.
Of course.
And so I think entrepreneurs, they could be open to coaching as well. So just getting different perspectives. So someone like me or, someone like yourself, we can bring a different perspective that maybe helps them grow.
Yeah.
And helps their business. I
think I have one coach, one mentor myself anyway, that I work with officially. And I think that's really helped my personal development. So 100% I resonate. I would always tell an entrepreneur who, when we are the only sounding board for them as an accountant, I would always advise them, get a mentor or get a coach, someone who's been there, done that, who can really help you in your business. And it makes a big difference for them as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. So Tanvir, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me. Brilliant.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us on the 𝗷 podcast. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and give us a 5-star rating and a review. For show notes and more, click on the link in the description. Connect with me directly on LinkedIn and search for Rehan Aleem. See you soon.